I don't believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. Not until my sister Lillian died. Some things in life can't be explained. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try to rationalize something, there's still that nagging feeling deep in your gut telling you. You saw what you saw, and once you see it, once you know the truth, you can't unsee it. Because the moment you start noticing them, they start noticing you. My grandmother, Margaret Calloway, died on an ordinary Tuesday. Mom refused to let anyone see the body before the funeral. She didn't want people seeing her like this, she kept saying. I should have known something was off, but I was too focused on Lillian. She was acting strange. At the funeral, while everyone whispered condolences, Lillian stood in front of the open casket, muttering. I leaned in. Lily, what are you saying? She turned to me, her eyes unfocused. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, she's not really dead. I felt my stomach drop. Before I could say anything, she lifted a single shaking finger and pointed at the casket, at Grandma's lips. I swear to God, they moved. That night, I woke up to a sound. Not a thump, not a creak, a click, a sharp, wet clicking sound, like someone tapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click. I sat up slowly. My room was pitch black. Then, click. It was coming from the hallway. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, switched on the flashlight. Through the open doorway, I saw her. Lillian, standing there, perfectly still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lily. My voice barely worked. She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring. Then she turned and walked away, but not like a normal person. Her feet barely touched the ground. After that night, I started seeing things, not just hearing them, seeing them. In the middle of the night, I'd wake up gasping for breath, feeling like someone was standing over me. I'd check my phone, but every time I did, the screen would glitch. One night, I woke up and saw a shadow crouched in the corner of my room. I thought it was a pile of clothes, until it moved. I didn't sleep after that. The night Lillian died, it was my fault. At least, that's what I told myself. We were driving home from a school event. She was in the passenger seat staring out the window, not blinking. I turned up the radio. The silence was suffocating. Then she whispered, "Grandma is watching us." I glanced at her. What? She didn't look at me, didn't blink. Then her body jerked violently, her back arching inhumanly. She started gasping, her fingers digging into her throat like she was choking. "Lillian!" I panicked, stepping on the gas, trying to get her to the hospital. Then, click. I froze. Slowly, her head snapped toward me. Her pupils were fully dilated. Her lips barely moved. "It's your turn now." And then, the stop sign, the pole, the impact, the wet crunch of bones snapping. Then, nothing. I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't. I stayed in my room, doors locked, curtains shut. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not at the door, inside the walls. I held my breath, listened. Then, click. I turned my head, and there she was, Lillian, standing in the doorway. Except, her head wasn't attached to her body, yet somehow I could still hear her breathing. She took a step forward, her body twitching violently. And then from the dark, a whisper. "It's your turn, Ethan." I should have left, but instead I started digging through Grandma's old things. That's when I found her journal. It wasn't just a diary. It was filled with rituals, symbols, names I didn't recognize. Except one. Azrael, the Watcher of Fate, a demon. And my family? We weren't just followers. We were his sacrifices. Lillian had been meant to be his vessel, but she died before the ritual was complete. So now, it needed someone else. It needed me. They took me that night. I woke up tied to an altar in an abandoned church, surrounded by figures in robes. At the front stood my mother. She held a ritual dagger, her face blank. The vessel is ready. I fought against the ropes, but it was useless. Then from the shadows, something began to emerge. Too tall, too thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally. Azrael. The thing moved toward me, its hollow face twisting into something almost human. I felt its presence inside me, pushing, forcing its way in. I couldn't breathe. My body wasn't mine anymore. Then, bang, a gunshot. A figure crashed through the doors. My father, the man who left us years ago. I thought he abandoned us, but no. He lifted the gun and shot my mom. The cult collapsed. The demon screamed as my father cut the bindings and pulled me from the altar. I turned to the writhing mass of shadow and limbs, and with everything I had left, I whispered, "You have no power over me." The church shook. The thing howled. Then, everything went silent. And just like that, it was over. Or so I thought. We left that night. Never looked back. I changed my name. Moved to another city. I should feel safe. But sometimes, at night, I hear it. A faint, distant clicking sound. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or did I just invite something worse in? It started the day my father died. He was a cold man, distant. I never truly knew him. But when he passed, my mother wouldn't let me see his body. "It's better if you don't, Elijah," she told me, her voice shaky. I thought she was just grieving, but there was something else in her eyes, something like fear. The funeral was small. No speeches, no eulogies, just a quick burial and silence. That night, as we drove home, I asked, "Mom, why won't you talk about Dad?" She tightened her grip on the wheel. "Because talking about him makes him remember you." I laughed nervously. "What? That doesn't even make sense." She didn't say anything else. She just stared at the road, knuckles white, breathing unsteady. The night after the funeral, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. My room was cold, too cold. At first I thought it was the AC, but then I saw it. A shadow standing in the corner of my room. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. A sick feeling grew in my stomach. My chest felt tight, like the air was suddenly too thick to breathe. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight. But the moment the light hit the corner, it was empty. 2 days later, I woke up with a burning sensation on my chest. It felt like something had been pressed against my skin while I slept. When I looked in the mirror, I saw it. A symbol burned into my skin, an unfamiliar mark, like some kind of ancient sigil. At first, I thought I had scratched myself in my sleep, but then it started moving. Right in front of my eyes, the lines of the mark twisted and shifted like they were alive. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. It wasn't a scar. It was a warning. I ran to my mom, lifting my shirt. "Mom, what the hell is this?" Her face went pale. She didn't speak. She just grabbed me by the wrist, yanking me into the living room. "Did you see him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard. "Who?" Her hands tightened on my arms. The Watcher. The air in the room suddenly felt suffocating. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I whispered. She let out a shaky breath. Azrael. The name itself made my body go cold. That night, she told me everything. Our family wasn't just cursed. We were chosen, marked by an ancient being called Azrael, the Watcher of Fate. Every few generations, someone in our bloodline was claimed. It started with dreams. Then the mark appeared. Then, they came to collect. That's why my father was so distant. He was supposed to die years ago, but he ran. And now, Azrael was coming for me instead. I locked my door that night. Not that it would help. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up again. The air felt thick, like I was breathing underwater. Then, click. My body locked up. I turned my head slowly toward the corner of my room. There it was, the shadow. But this time, it was closer. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up. The shadow tilted its head at an unnatural angle. Then it moved, not like a person, like something trying to remember how to be human. A whisper slithered through the darkness. Elijah. My entire body jerked. It knew my name, Elijah. The voice was wrong, like something trying to mimic speech but failing. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. Then came the third whisper. Elijah! A searing pain tore through my chest, spreading from the mark. I felt something pulling me under, like my body wasn't mine anymore. I was slipping. Then, I bit down on my tongue, hard. The taste of blood filled my mouth, and just like that, the shadow vanished. The pain stopped. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the floor. But before I could fully process what had happened, I heard it. From the corner of my room, a soft, slow click. I packed my bags that morning, told my mom I was leaving town. She just shook her head. You don't understand, she said. Azrael isn't tied to a place. He's tied to you. That night, I called my uncle, the only person in my family who had ever left. When he picked up, I whispered, Uncle David, I think it's happening to me. The line went dead silent. Then he spoke, his voice shaking. Listen to me very carefully. Whatever you do not let him say your name 3 times. I felt my stomach drop. Why? Because if he does, your body won't be yours anymore. That night, I didn't sleep, but it didn't matter. Because at 3:12 a.m., I heard footsteps in my room. Slow, deliberate. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The shadow stood at the foot of my bed, whispering, Elijah. I shook violently. Elijah. I felt something inside me twisting, pulling me deeper into the dark. Then the final whisper, Elijah. I smashed my bedside lamp onto the floor. The light flooded the room, and just like that, Azrael was gone. I left that night, drove until I saw the sunrise. I haven't been back home since, but sometimes, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I wake up. My room is too cold, and in the silence, just before I fall back asleep, I hear it. A faint, distant clicking sound, and I wonder, did I really escape, or did I just delay the inevitable? Some families pass down wealth. Others pass down dark secrets. Mine, we pass down a debt to something ancient, a curse that doesn't end with death. It just moves to the next in line. I thought my grandfather's ramblings about the debt were just the delusions of a dying man, until he died, and it became my turn. My grandfather, William Mercer, passed away last month. Before he died, he made one final request. Don't bury me in the family plot. We thought it was just another one of his delusions, so we ignored it. We buried him with the rest of our ancestors. That was our first mistake. That was when the curse moved on. 3 nights after the funeral, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my window. Tap, tap, tap. I live on the 2nd floor. I sat up, heart hammering. The room was ice cold. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as a tree branch, the tapping moved to my closet door. The next morning, I told my mother. She didn't dismiss it. She just went pale. Then she said something I will never forget. It's starting again. She took me into the attic, where I had never been allowed before. There, she opened an old wooden chest. Inside were dozens of old photographs, all of them featuring our family members standing next to an unfamiliar man. Same black suit, same hollow eyes. The pictures spanned over 100 years, and in every single one, the man never aged. My mother told me everything. Our family is cursed. A long time ago, one of our ancestors struck a deal with something inhuman. They gained wealth, status, and influence, but in return, every generation, the firstborn must serve the collector, the man in the photos. My grandfather had been the last to fulfill the contract, and now that he was dead, it was my turn. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. That's when I saw it. A symbol, carved into my skin, just above my heart. I touched it, and a searing pain shot through my chest. The mirror cracked. Behind me, in the reflection, I saw him. The man from the photos, standing in my doorway, watching. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I woke up gasping for breath. The room was darker than it should have been, as if the shadows had deepened. And then I heard it. A voice whispering from the darkness. It is time. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. My blankets slid off me on their own, exposing my bare chest, exposing the mark. Cold, skeletal fingers pressed against my skin, tracing the symbol. You belong to me now, the voice whispered. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I knew running wasn't an option. I needed answers. I needed to know how my grandfather had survived for so long. So, I did something no one in my family had ever done before. I went looking for the truth. I broke into my grandfather's study, a place that had been locked for years. Inside, I found a wall of books, dusty and untouched. Many were written in Latin, Old English, and some language I didn't recognize. One book stood out, bound in black leather, pages yellowed with age. The title? The Ledger of the Collector. I flipped through it, my hands shaking. It was filled with names, all written in red ink, names of my ancestors, and at the very end of the list, my name. But there was something else. At the bottom of the page, a single note written in my grandfather's handwriting. The only way out is through the past. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. There was one person left in my family who had escaped this fate. My great-uncle, Edward Mercer, a man who had disappeared 30 years ago. I tracked him down to a cabin in the woods, miles away from civilization. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised to see me. You've seen him, haven't you? He said. I nodded. He let me in, locking 3 separate deadbolts behind us. Tell me how to stop it, I begged. His face was tired, hollow, like a man who had been running from something his whole life. You can't stop it, he said, but there's a way to pass it on. I froze. Pass it on? To who? I whispered. He looked me dead in the eyes. To the one who started it. If what Uncle Edward said was true, there was one way out. A ritual that could reverse the contract. But it required a sacrifice. I had to dig up my grandfather's grave. At midnight, I stood over the grave, shovel in hand, rain pouring down. My heart pounded as I unearthed the coffin. The second I opened the lid, the collector was there, grinning. You cannot undo what is written, he whispered. I ignored him. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the black ledger. The book trembled in my hands, its pages turning on their own. And then, the names started fading, the ink turning black. I held my grandfather's rotting hand, forcing it onto the page. The mark on my chest burned like fire. The collector screamed. The ground beneath me shook violently, and then everything went silent. I looked down. The mark on my chest was gone, and in the coffin, where my grandfather's corpse had been, was the collector. Eyes wide, mouth open in silent rage, I slammed the lid shut, buried him, and walked away. For the first time in my life, I felt free. No tapping on my window, no shadows in the dark, no whispers at 3:33 a.m. I thought I had won. Until I got home, I opened my grandfather's old ledger, flipping to the final page. My name was gone, but there was a new one written in fresh ink, my mother's, and behind me, a familiar voice. The debt is paid, for now.